Of all the doctrines in the scope of Christian theology, the identity of Jesus is one that we have to get right. If we miss this one, nothing else we believe matters. If Jesus is not the Son of God, if he is not divinity in the flesh, then everything else falls apart. So is it possible to know for sure who Jesus was? Here are two support structures to validate the claim that Jesus is divine. First, his own testimony about himself. It's been argued that Jesus was just a teacher and subsequent generations idolized him to a point where eventually he became legend and people began to worship him as a god. But if you look closely at the recordings in the four Gospels, transcripts of which we have that date back to the 1st century, you'll see that Jesus makes very specific claims about himself. And there are many references, but one in particular that stands out is in Luke chapter 4. Here, Jesus is teaching in the synagogue, and he reads from Isaiah 61. And I'll put the verse right up here on the screen for you to read. It's a passage about God's Messiah. Jesus reads it, sits down, and says, "Today this scripture is fulfilled right here." Jesus was making a bold claim. In fact, by the time he was done teaching, the religious leaders wanted to throw him off of a cliff because they understood what he believed about himself. He clearly thought himself to be the Messiah. Beyond that, we have many self-references to divinity. In John 10, Jesus says, "I and the Father are one." Then we see in John 14 where he says that no one comes to the Father except through me. Then there's the famous "I am" passage in John chapter 8. His hearers knew exactly what he was claiming when Jesus said, "Before Abraham was, I am." He identified himself as Yahweh, as the God of the Old Testament. Not just, "I'm anointed by God," or "I understand God better than you do," or "God likes me more than he likes you." No, he says that he is God, one and the same. Scripture is abundantly clear that Jesus believed himself to be divine. Next, we have several classical reasons that Christ is God. So here are those 5 key arguments. One is reasons from ascription. If Jesus is repeatedly called God in the Bible, then he must either be God or the scriptures are false. Next, reasons from the divine attributes. If he is ascribed attributes that could only rightly be ascribed to God, such as uncreated and eternal, holy, unsurpassable power, then he must be God. 3, reasons from God's actions. If Jesus performed actions and miracles that only God could do, like forgiving sins or raising the dead, then he must be God. 4, reasons from the adoration of the worshiping community. If he willingly accepted the worship due only to God from a community that was historically adamantly against worshiping a human being, then he must either be a blasphemer or he is God. And then 5, the Son is equal to the Father. He didn't need to grasp at equality with God, is what Philippians 2:7 tells us. He always was, is, and will be the eternal, equal Son of the Father. Now, all of this ties together. Even those are 5 very, very brief summaries of those arguments, each of which has been fleshed out in much, much more detail over the last 2,000 years. But all of it ties together, and as Odin says, it's really, really hard to make sense of the New Testament without the idea that Jesus is God incarnate. If you remove that belief, the New Testament becomes little more than a history book about a strange group of people who committed their lives to a delusional carpenter. But taking into account Jesus' claims about himself, those made about him by his most immediate followers, all of that has led Christians to validate the belief that Jesus is truly God in the flesh. And this is what differentiates Christianity from other religious systems. The person of Jesus is actually God Himself among us. A suffering Messiah who is less than God may elicit our pity or even our admiration, but not our worship. A Messiah to whom one cannot pray is not the Christ of the New Testament. And so for 2,000 years, classic Christianity has trusted in the belief that Jesus, He is truly God. Thanks for watching. I would love your help building up the TCB community, so please share my videos like this one on your social media platforms, and be sure to sign up for our email list for more great content.